Well, good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. And it's great to be back with our online audience after a few weeks away. Welcome to you wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest, Jordan Rosenblum, and I'll introduce Jordan to you in just a moment. A little bit of housekeeping first. Do ask questions. You can do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. And as always, we'll try our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Let me also point out the chat facility. This lets you send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. And finally, we are recording this event, and it will appear on the Milim website at milim.org.uk in the next couple of days. There you will find recordings of many of our back programs and also details of our future bookings for which you can get tickets online. And so to our guest this evening, Jordan Rosenblum is the Belzer Professor of Classical Judaism and Director of the Moss Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research focuses on the literature, law, and social history of the rabbinic movement in general, and in particular on rabbinic food regulations. He's the author and co-editor of several books, including this one, Forbidden, a 3,000-year history of Jews and the pig, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. So Jordan, welcome to Milim. It's really, really great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
And for those slightly less observant members of our audience, Jordan's shirt is very appropriate to the subject we're talking about. So Jordan, we're going to talk about the connections between Jews and the pig. But before we get into that, what's your personal fascination with this subject?
Well, I've been working on this in one way or another for over 20 years now, because I was a grad student and I kept finding references to the pig, and I wrote little pieces of it, but I kept finding, whether I was looking at ancient, medieval, modern times, Jews and non-Jews using the pig to talk about Jewish identity. And it took me to all sorts of corners of history, temporally and geographically. And so I just kept saving references. And eventually I realized I had to write a book about it. And this is actually my fourth book I've written. And the first three, after I finished them, I was kind of done with them. It's like when you put together a jigsaw puzzle, right? Like you could glue it together, but always I was someone who, I looked at it for a second and I break it all apart and put it back in the box, and I was done with it. This is the first puzzle that I put together that I'm still interested in. I'm still fascinated with. I'm still finding references to add to that.
So I think 20 years is probably a record for anybody that's been on this webinar by some considerable distance. I think we've had probably somewhere between 5 and 10 years for one or two books, but certainly not 20. Now you write about pig and not pork. What's the distinction?
So if we talk about pork, people think of it just as a food item on a plate. And part of what I was saying is this is so much more. It's about how the animal is understood, how the animal is used, the fact that it's an animal, and the fact that it's food. And the fact that the pig was used to talk about Jewish bodies by and non-Jew and Jews to talk about non-Jewish bodies. And so the fact that it's not just, a food item, but it was so much more, seems really important, because again, I feel like what I was always saying over and over again in this book is there's so much more to this story that people have written about pieces of it or knew about one piece or another, but no one actually put together. Right? And so part of it is the fact that and it can be a lovable pig, like the pigs on my shirt, right? Which I like to think are lovable ones. And it can be a really catastrophic pig, as ones I talk about, and I'm happy to talk more about that involve real violence. And within that body is food and all of those possibilities.
Now, the biblical prohibition against food covers quite a number of animals, not just the pig.
Right.
So why is it that the pig stands out? What's special about the pig?
Well, from the perspective of the Bible, it doesn't really. That's if I say in the beginning, right? If all you had was actually what it says in the Bible, you wouldn't think I could write a whole book about this. It spends equal time talking about the camel and the rock badger and the hare and so many other animals. But it's that after story where Jews and non-Jews continuously use the pig to talk about this that it comes. So part of it is people, everyone wants to run back to the Bible, but if you look at the Bible has actually relatively little to say about the pig. It says in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, there's the don't eat pig, but don't eat lots of other animals. And then besides of that, only 5 other mentions of the pig appear in the Bible. It's a bit part. It doesn't get a main role.
The book follows a chronology of sorts, and one thing that struck me in the early part of the book is you say we can tell the broader history of Jews and Judaism in the latter half of the Second Temple period by means of the pig.
Yeah.
How does that work?
So around the time of the what is the story of Hanukkah, which is pretty well known, I assume, by this audience, but if I'm happy to explain more about it if people would like. There's a lot going on in Jewish history at that time. And one of the things that scholars will talk about is how at that time there's also a movement from understanding Judaism as an ethnic group to also understanding of it as a religion, which means you can convert into and out of it. Like I can't, no matter how much I love Italian food, I can't convert to being Italian. I can learn Italian language. I could love Italian food. I can't convert to becoming Italian. I could convert to Roman Catholicism, right? Because that's a religion. And Judaism, if you study its history, kind of different times in different places, Jews and non-Jews have understood Judaism as a religion or as an ethnicity. And that's a complicated history that we could talk about too. But where I'm getting at that is at the time when that first move starts being made, the first time it kind of there's a move to understand it as a religion, is also the time when the earliest stories of Hanukkah actually tell us very little about olive oil, but they send a lot about the pig. They talk about Jews being forced to either eat pig or be gruesomely martyred, and at that time, Jews choosing martyrdom over eating the pig as symbolic of choosing what they understood to be authentic Judaism for them. And that, so when you're looking at those stories, which was this dramatic moment in Jewish history, this pivotal moment where so much is happening and changing, pig has a central role there. And so to not talk about the pig at that moment is to miss what's going on there and how people spoke about it. Olive oil plays a very minor role. It's only hundreds of years later that olive oil sort of takes center stage. And so I'm trying to get at that moment, how pig played a central role. And then moving forward, as you're telling different moments in Jewish history, the pig is there. It's often ignored, but it's there. And if you look for it, and sometimes not even that hard, it's right there. And so that's what I was getting at. And I'm sure a certain amount of it is like, if you go looking for pigs, you'll find them, right? And if you're ignoring them, you'll ignore them. I was looking for pigs and I found them.
So you mentioned there Jewish martyrdom around pig meat. And as you point out in the book, and as I'm sure some of our audience, or maybe all of our audience will also be aware, there are activities that a Jew should choose to be killed rather than do. But eating pig is not one of those things. So why is it you feel that the pig is associated with martyrdom?
Well, so that's actually, you're pointing to, so when you're talking about the activities you're supposed to choose to not transgress, right, even at the point of life, that's a rabbinic injunction. So here's the important thing is, what we're talking about the Maccabees and these moments of the story, it's the Second Temple period, it's pre-rabbinic, and they had a notion based on also broader notions in Greek and Roman philosophy, of the idea that to not eat pig was to live a principled life. And to then eat pig, but still live, would be to then live an unprincipled life, right? And so you choose the principled death in that sense. The rabbis, on an interpretation of, there's a biblical injunction to live by them, to live by these commandments. The rabbis say, well, live by them, not die by them. And so they argue that with the exception of three commandments, which is not, you can't murder someone. So that's unjustified homicide, right? So if someone says, I will kill you unless you kill that person, you should let yourself be killed instead, because whose blood is redder, right? Who can decide? That's God's job to decide who lives, right? So it's different than like protecting someone else, right? Where there's a different ethical rule there. There's forbidden sexual relations, so that's your incest and other taboos, right? And idolatry. The idea being that if they say bow down to another idol, the idea of monotheism is so central that you're then violating a central tenet. But everything else, so if someone says, I'll kill you unless you eat pork, eat pork. That's what the rabbis would say. So they interpret it differently. But what that shows, and this is also why pig gets you to understanding the history of Judaism, is that the rabbis have a different view of things, and their stance towards, they still hate the pig, and they talk a lot about how they put a lot of baggage onto it, but they would act differently in those situations because they have a different theological understanding.
So as we enter what you refer to as the classic rabbinic period, you look at euphemisms for the pig or its meat, and it's something you come back to in the book on occasions. I suppose my question is, well, the Torah actually mentions the pig by name. Why couldn't the rabbis?
Well, they could, but remember, when the Torah is talking about it, the pig is not so special, right? So this is the standard distinction, right, between the Torah and Torah writ large, right? For the Torah is the written text, that's the Tanakh, that's the Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, that's the Hebrew Bible. And Torah, rabbinic literature and interpretations, is a much more expansive thing. So the Torah, it's not such a big deal in. But when we're talking about Torah, we're talking about rabbinic texts. Pig means something more. Pig stands as exceptional. And so to even mention it seems laden with complications, right? So there are texts that will mention it, but they oftentimes talk around it. They call it davar acher, they talk something else, that other thing, right? And so what you're seeing is communities reacting differently because the interpretations of things have changed, right? The meaning of the word has changed, right? And that happens in languages. A word means one thing, a couple of generations later, it means something else. And so when the pig is used in the Torah, it's one of many other animals that's forbidden. But it becomes to mean the exceptional animal by rabbinic times. So then to even say it seems not kosher.
Now you talk about the Romans, and you refer to the Romans as the pig, but capitalized,
right?
Proper noun. What do you mean by that?
So the rabbis, and there are some Second Temple texts that start to do this too, start to identify animals with kingdoms, and Rome gets identified with the pig, and there's a few reasons for that. One is Rome itself, right? They enjoyed eating pig, but also in what is either a divine message or a quirk of history or a coincidence, right? The Roman legion that destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE, their symbol was the boar, right? So they struck coins. I show images in the book, right, where their symbol is the pig, and so there's pig coins, right? So the pig destroyed the temple, right? And also there's a rabbinic text that I quite love, which is a Genesis Rabbah, this a commentary on the book of Genesis that says, well, the pig and Rome are the same in that the pig looks kosher on the outside because it has split hooves, right? Because if you're a quadruped, if you have four legs and you're a domesticated animal, you're supposed to have split hooves and chew the cud to be kosher. pigs outside look kosher because they're split hooves, but they don't chew the cud, so it belies their treif, their non-kosher insides, right? And they say, well, Rome has these law courts, but their law courts were notoriously corrupt, right? And so they say it's a hypocrisy. And we'll see, and we can talk about that in a bit too. Pigs get, in both Jewish and Christian texts, are viewed as hypocritical animals. And I think it goes back to the biblical idea that they look kosher on the outside, right? And they're the only animal that's pegged as that, even in the biblical text, as looking kosher on the outside, but being non-kosher on the inside. So it becomes an obvious metaphor for hypocrisy.
Well, you mentioned Christianity, and as your book moves into the medieval period, you talk quite a lot about Christianity.
Yeah.
Why is Christianity so important in a book about Jews and pigs?
So part of that is, you have all of this data and you're trying to figure out how to tell a story through line through. So what point do you introduce what element of the story, right? And the Christianity becomes a huge part. One is, Christianity develops out of Judaism. The earliest, Jesus was critiquing Second Temple Judaism, right? So there's a outgrowth from that. So there's a certain shared conversation. But also, it's that in medieval times, the history of Jews and Christians is very much of not sometimes directly in conflict, and particularly includes lots of violence against Jews. But Jews are often used as a category in Christianity to talk about Christians, right? David Nierenberg has a book where he talks about anti-Judaism, the idea that the Jew is sort of this rhetorical other, that's this boogeyman that's used to discuss bad Christians, right? So even when they're talking about Jews, when they seem like they're talking about Jews, they're really talking about Christians, right? So so when you're looking at the pig rhetoric, they're talking sometimes about actual Jews, sometimes about just generic abstract anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism, and other times, right, about Christians who they think are bad Christians, so they're like Jews, and pigs become a way to talk about that. And so I've tried other ways where I had some of it in earlier chapters and some of it later, and what I realized is that the medieval chapter was really dominated by the discussion of Christianity, so I put it there to say it. So it could have been, the data could have been sliced different ways, but for me, I felt that was the most straightforward way to tell that story.
There's a couple of things that stick out in that chapter. One is this idea of the Judenschau.
Yeah.
What's that, and where did it come from?
So when I was talking earlier about the fact that Christians used the pig to talk about an embodiment of virtues and vices, right? Well, they used animals in general, but the pig, right, was hypocrisy. The pig was seen as greedy, and this was common, by the way, throughout Europe. You had in English churches. I told you before I was going to try and stick in as much about England as possible. I'll even stick in some about colonies, but I'll leave America out of it, so you can get a pass on that one. We'll have to deal with that one ourselves. So, but when you're talking about the Judenschau, so it starts in England. In England, though, and other parts of Europe, they have images in churches of animals, but they're just general virtues and vices. In Germany, in particular, it starts to develop not just connecting the pig as greedy and hypocritical and an embodiment of vice, but Jews with the pig. And then it becomes a vulgar joke, and it gets more and more and more vulgar until it becomes so vulgar that they kind of stop doing it in churches, but continue the joke on. But the idea they imagine Jews is wanting to drink its urine and eat its excrement. And by the way, there was in early modernity, there was a claim among some Germans that that's why Jews wanted to be doctors, because at that time, doctors would often drink urine to test things that nowadays we have, tests where you go to a lab, you urinate in a cup and then the lab technician does medical things to it, right? It used to be that the doctor would drink it. And so they thought, oh, that's why Jews wanted to be doctors. But so they would depict Jews as wanting to, and and it was a way of ridiculing Jews by saying that they're piggish, and that they love the pig. And it's also, I think, gendered too, because they're always a sow, so it's a mother pig, and they're imagining their Jewish mothers as pigs, and it just became more and more vulgar, more and more dirty, in the sense of a dirty joke, not in the sense of physically dirty, right? To the point where then it became too awkward to have, and it was so vulgar that it was like, is church the appropriate place to make this joke? Which the question wasn't asked, is this joke inappropriate? It was, is this the wrong place to make the joke? But that was particular to Germany. But more broadly, the idea of animals as virtues and vices was common. And by the way, that makes sense. Jewish texts did that too, right? Animals being, some being virtuous, some being vices. It's a nice metaphor. And the Hebrew Bible uses that as metaphor. To go back to it, I said eagles are seen as greedy in the Hebrew Bible, and lions. These are animals that are used to talk about bad metaphors, and they're used a lot more than the pig.
The other subject that jumps out is the Inquisition. So how did pigs figure in the Inquisition?
Well, in lots of ways. One is the very term Marrano that many people know, that which is a derogatory term for a Jew who, right, the choice was given to Jews to either convert to Catholicism, flee, or be killed. Which is not, none of those are great choices, right? If you'd like, you'd like, I'd like a redo on that, right? And say, but given that choice, many Jews converted, and of real conviction. That can't be discounted. There are some who did, and many converted who pretended to convert and practiced Judaism in secrecy. And in practicing, and so a term that began to refer to Jews who converted and pretended to be Christian, but were really Jewish in secret. Again, setting up that metaphor of looking kosher on the outside, but being not kosher on the inside, were Marranos, which is a term that meant pigs. And that's a term that was common across Europe, to mock those Jews. Those Christians who were really Jews in their mind, right? Also, if you look amongst discussions of Inquisition reports, one of the common accusations against someone is they're not eating pig, right? So, so this person was accused of not eating pig. Even Voltaire talks about that in Candide, of someone who, removing bacon from their sandwich, right? And you have these accounts where people say, no, I eat lots of non-kosher food. I just don't like pig, right? And it's not, I'm Catholic, but I don't like pig. And you have other texts, I quote some of them, that talk about like look how much pig I eat. Look how Catholic I am, right? The more pig you eat, the better Catholic you are. In 18th century Burgundy poems goes, right? So the idea being that like, look how Catholic I am. It's one of the theories behind why in Spain to this day you see pigs displayed in windows, right? To show like, look, pig here, Catholic, not Jewish. Which you can also see could be read as either proof, or if you're looking for a conspiracy theory, to say, look, they're pretending to be, right? I don't see them eating it. I just see them showing it, right? And so you can see how that, but again, my point is, from all sides, you're getting assaulted by the pig. And everyone is using the pig to tell their story of this. And that's what I'm trying to bring out, is this complex, rich, sometimes violent, and very difficult to stomach elements of Jewish history.
And it certainly works in a fascinating way. Now you moving on in the book, we come to the early modern period. You're talking here, I think, 1500 to 1800 of the Common Era, and of course, Shakespeare is very something we Brits hold very close to our hearts. What's the story with Shakespeare and Jews and the pig?
Well, I mean, Merchant of Venice, which is pretty famous, right? I'm going to pretend like I've memorized it, but really I just have it right in front of me, so I can say it's Act 1, Scene 3, lines 26 to 30. it's Bassanio and Shylock are talking, right? And Bassanio invites Shylock to dine with us. And Shylock replies, yes, to smell pork, to eat of the habitation which your prophet, the Nazarite, conjured the devil into. This is referencing New Testament text that talks about Jesus casting legion into a herd of swine, which I open up the medieval chapter with. So Shakespeare's talking about that, and then there's a series of British authors who refer to that and refer to Shakespeare talking about it. I will buy with you, sell with you, talk with you, walk with you, and so following, but I will not eat with you, drink with you, nor pray with you. Right? And so he opens up by saying, no, I'm not going to, right? Like Christian identity begins with pig, right? And he uses that as a demarcation. And it's what there you're also seeing, it's a convenient shorthand, right? It's like, if a not subtle TV show or movie wants to tell you their character's bad, they might have them kick a puppy, right? Or like, or sneer at a baby or something like. And you're immediately supposed to say, "Oh, that's a bad person," right? That way, by making that reference to pork and Jews, that you're immediately supposed to read all of those associations into it.
One of the most fascinating parts of the book for me is where you describe these false messiahs of the 17th and 18th centuries, and this character Joseph of Rohotanin, who takes a slice of bread during Passover and puts pork on it and then butter on it, and as if that wasn't bad enough, he washes it down with some non-kosher wine. Why on earth was he doing that?
So that became part of the story that I start there and move on. And I think parts of it could probably be earlier, but it was hard for me to find any evidence for it. But to me, this is a very critical. I want to zoom out first, then I'll zoom in. A critical part of this story is the fact that, and I want to make it clear, I don't think it's good or bad for a Jew to eat or not eat pig. What I'm fascinated in is the stories that people tell about why they do or don't and how they understand it. And what I really want to make sure is part of this story is the fact that people tend to imagine there's Jews who eat pig are bad and Jews who don't eat pig are good. And if a Jew who eats pig is renouncing Jewish identity. And what I found is there are many Jews who chose to eat pig in complex ways, but the discussion of it, their understanding of it was fundamentally part of their Jewish identity. Right. And so this was a great way to get into that conversation, to start with that. So there are these, particularly I was talking about Shabbatai Tzvi and Jacob Frank, these figures who claimed to be messianic figures. They had huge followings, particularly Shabbatai Tzvi had a very large following. And part of their understanding based on Kabbalah was the idea of, they wanted to capture the sparks, right? The idea of a creation, God was everywhere and God contracts. And God's sparks of holiness get put into vessels and something happens and they shatter and they go everywhere. And part of the job of Jews is to try and capture those sparks and bring them back to kind of make God whole again. And so they developed a theology where you needed to radically transgress as a way of this. But that's, again, a transgressing Judaism, but in a Jewish manner. So it's really complicated. And so they started to come up with what's the trafiest trafe they could do, right? So on the Sabbath, we're going to do that. Now, ironically, in terms of rabbinic texts, mixing milk and meat and rabbinic understanding requires the meat to be, for that to apply, the meat has to have the potential to be kosher. So, cow, no matter how it's slaughtered, has the potential to be kosher, right? So therefore it would apply. Pig has no potential to be kosher. So actually having milk with it is not an additional prohibition, right? It's just the bad of eating the pig. I'm not saying eat pig. I'm also not saying don't eat pig, right? But I'm just saying to clarify that. But it's interesting that people want to bring that up because they see it like, how can I pile this on top of that, right? And then wash it down with some non-kosher wine.
But it's no worse.
Right. It's no worse, but they want it to be. But again, the thing that people will say, look at this transgression. I'm like, yeah, but they're understanding it in a way that points back to their understanding of their Jewish identity. Right? So it's tricky in a way that I find fascinating.
Moving on to more recent times, it was quite a pleasure to read about the 1992 film Leon the Pig Farmer, which is set in Yorkshire. And of course, we at Millim, based in Leeds, we are in Yorkshire. And much of that film was made nearby in the Yorkshire Dales. What's your fascination with that film?
Well, I mean, if you're someone who's interested in Jews and the pig and popular culture, there aren't that many movies. There's a ton of movies and TV shows that make a passing reference, right? But you're not going to get an extended reflection on it. And so to me, I loved that. I mean, it's kind of slapsticky, right? So sometimes it's really funny, sometimes you roll your eyes, right? And it's watching a movie from 1992. Some parts hold up, some parts less so, right? With the perspective, right? I don't want to say it was old, but it came out the year I was bar mitzvahed. So if I say it's old, then I'm old, right? So, but it was just that engagement, but it also gets to the exact points I'm making, right? It's a character, and I could point all of the plot hole flaws, but no one wants that, right? But if you if you suspend your belief for a moment and just kind of turn off my scholarly brain ish, like the looking for the flaws, I would say that the reason I like it is it takes seriously the complex Jewish identity of what happens if you're Jewish and it turns out that your biological parents are pig farmers. Now, the honest answer is nothing, actually, really. But if your biological mother is Jewish, you're Jewish. Doesn't matter if your biological father happens to raise pigs, whether he's Jewish or not, right? But that's not interesting for the story. But and I would say that's also really besides the point of what I want to tell too, because the fact that he's concerned about it and that he struggles with it and he tries to understand it is exactly what I'm saying. It's just because it's not, it's really interesting when it isn't actually a legal problem, like a halachic, a Jewish legal problem, but it's a cultural baggage problem. And that's what that's getting at. It's that other side of the story. And so, I mean, I don't get that many films or TV shows that take it actually seriously. So that's why I love it.
Just a reminder to our audience, if you do have questions for Jordan, please do type them in the Q&A in the next few minutes. We've had the Dreyfus affair in the news quite recently with the posthumous promotion of Dreyfus to Brigadier General. How does the pig figure in his story?
Well, part of the rhetoric of anti-Dreyfus, right? We have posters that sort of mock Dreyfus. They bring in the Rothschilds, and they use pigs again to mock Jewish identity and to imagine Jewish hypocrisy and to sling accusations against Jews. And so again, it's if you're looking for a grab bag of tricks of how to dehumanize and mock Jews, the pig, depicting Jews as pigs, depicting Jews as riding pigs, depicting Jews as piggish is low-hanging fruit, right? We're talking about slapstick comedy. It's the banana peel on the floor, right? It's the obvious joke to go with, and because it's so obvious, it makes people like me who are interested in getting at this history of an idea. It makes my job easier. It also makes it harder because it's in so many places that you have to I couldn't get to all the things. I'm still collecting references I found post publishing the book because it's just everywhere. And so at a certain point, it was hard for me to find them, but finally I hit a point where I'm like, I have enough that I have the outline of it. And everything I was finding was kind of fitting within it. And I'm happy to say that the things I found subsequent to publishing it, they all still fit within the frame that I saw, right? The narrative frame. They're just more evidence and support.
I think that there is a Hebrew a novel in Hebrew in a similar vein. I don't think it's a comedy, but it's about someone who goes to farm pigs
Yep.
in Israel. But that segues neatly to the modern state of Israel.
Yep.
And you do write quite a bit about pigs in Israel. What did you discover?
Well, there's a lot of things. So there's Daphne Barak Erez, who was a law professor and now is a Supreme Court justice, wrote a whole book about the development of law in Israel by looking at legislation about pigs, right? Because if this one of the central tensions of the modern state of Israel, right, is it's a Jewish democracy, but is that a contradiction, right? If how can you be fully democratic if you're informed by Jewish law, right, which is then going to clearly weigh things in a certain era and a balance, right? So can it be both? And so she looked at the ways that pig rules are used to kind of play out that tension. And so, for example, that can you sell pig in you sell pork in Israel, and it gets the answer is one that I love to give the answer, which is it depends, right? And so they develop this balancing test that as well as the neighborhood predominantly Jewish. Well, then you're kind of going by the predominance of the neighborhood. So no, so it's okay, it's kosher to prohibit it in that neighborhood. What about in a very Christian neighborhood or a Muslim neighborhood or something that's predominantly non-Jewish? Well, then the balancing test goes the other way. You would say, well, then it would be it would go against constitutional law because now you're imposing the will of the minority on the majority. And if it's kind of a 50-50 neighborhood, they kind of leave it up to balance, right? And then there have been cases over and over again. There was a case I bring up where all the military, the Israeli military, is has a policy of keeping kosher, but someone who was in the army brought a ham sandwich onto base, and he was thrown in the brig, right? But then it got all this attention, and at what point does that enforcement go? What does that mean to do, right? And again, what you see is it becomes a proxy for discussions of secular versus religious authority in Israel. And it becomes a way of talking about other things. So it's not just the sandwich, it's what the sandwich represents. And we having just been through a pandemic when the H1N1, when the swine flu came out in Israel, to call it the swine flu would have been problematic for multiple ways. Number one, people would say, well, if I don't eat pig, I don't have to worry about it, right? The resolution to it was problematic in other ways. They called it the Mexican flu because they viewed it as starting in Mexico. So that's problematic in other ways, right? But the idea of could you call it that? Would people take it seriously? What's going on there? Like that's again, and there are several more instances of that in Israel where it plays out in complex ways. And I keep saying that because that's what interests me is it's not a simple story. And it appears in so many contexts that gets us into so many corners of history.
As we move to the final chapter of the book, you look at the United States and something you call safe trafe.
Yes.
What's safe about what's safe about it?
So the idea being that it's kind of dipping your toe in, and you're willing to transgress, but you're not. So going out and eating a pork chop is trafe, right? But and so this comes up, and this actually was two sociologists, Tuckman and Levine. This was their concept, so I should make sure I'm giving credit to them. And they're talking about the history of Jews and Chinese food in particular, which in America is quite associated. And there are lots of reasons for it. One is just patterns of immigration. If you look at on the Lower East Side of New York City, you'll still see signs in Chinese and Yiddish right next to each other, right? And so, but there are a variety of reasons that they're connected. And if you want more, you can look up their article or read the book. But particularly about safe trafe, one of the arguments is it's a chance to kind of dip your toe in the water of that. And there are a few ways. Number one, Chinese food doesn't have milk in it, right? So if you grew up not eating meat and milk together, or if you are unwilling to transgress everything, right, you don't have to worry about that. That takes, right? It's the taking all of that issue. You never have to try and figure out the meat milk thing, okay? But then you say, well, and this is today. Chinese food doesn't seem as exotic or foreign, if at least I can't speak from the British perspective, but from American perspective, it's like in small shopping malls. It's a very common American. It's as it's an American food at this point, right? And the and but at that time, which was about 100 years ago, right? It was seen as different, and people didn't know the difference between mushu and lo mein, and and chop suey, and all sorts of, and all those terms are complicated, and we can talk about the history of those. But they didn't know the differences between that. Really, it was insider, like hipster kind of thing, to know about that. And so, if you didn't ask too many questions, and it was shredded meat, you could, maybe that's chicken. And you could not ask the question and just presume. And notice, though, you would be eating non-kosher chicken, but to eat non-kosher chicken felt different than to eat pork, right? Um, so you see how it became a way and this does not represent all Jews. Some chose to not eat it. Some eventually, there also is and still is today, many like kosher Chinese restaurants. But for some who wanted to dip their toe in the water of stepping into a different understanding of Judaism, and I'm not even going to say assimilationist, right? Because for some it was assimilationist, but some it was a different understanding of Judaism. That was a way to do it without, right? Because again, pig was that dividing line. And so it was a way to, if I don't ask that question, right? It becomes, I think I've made this pun before, Schrodinger's pig, right? Like, if I don't ask, I can both simultaneously have eaten and not eaten it at the same time. But once I ask, I know the answer.
And yet, American Jews, as you point out, seem to excuse shellfish far more readily
Yes.
than pork.
Yeah, and I love that. There's a humorist, David Rakoff, who sadly passed away, who has a great line that I quote, which I think I'm going to get this right, but basically he said, shrimp is treif, pork is anti-Semitic, and it says no Jew ever died from being forced to eat shrimp, right? But is the shellfish, right? Because same biblical texts that prohibit pig, if you read further down, it talks about aquatic animals, and it says fins and scales. So if they must have fins and scales. It doesn't say anything about bottom feeders or anything, but shrimp, lobster, clams, oysters don't have fins and scales. But they didn't get that same history. If I was to write, one day I would like to write an article on the history of like sort of some of these associations with shellfish in Judaism. I couldn't write a book on it. It would be well, I could, but it would be a really short book. It would be stretching the book, right? It's an article. It's interesting, but it's not. It's a little side story, right? And because shellfish doesn't get invested with the same identity statement. So for a Jew to eat shellfish is not seen as dramatic as a Jew to eat pig, right? And then there's some who tried to argue in America that Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, who was predominant in the reform movement and very much got reform movement going in America. He said, well, oysters, which were very popular in America at the time, they're like ocean vegetables, right? And so they shouldn't count. But he didn't make that argument for pig. There's a difference there, and I think that difference relates to the history of it. One has a ton of baggage for it; it means something, and one is just garden variety, not kosher.
I think you mentioned the Reform rabbi's inauguration dinner, or maybe
the
where
tray banquet. Yeah,
many kinds of shellfish are served, but
not pig.
But not pig. Now we've had a question from Yvonne Cheney, who's watching in Southern California, and she says we have vegan bacon. What do you think about products like this for Jews? And in fact, we've another question about lab-grown meat. Will our attitudes change? Now I know you write a bit about Impossible Pork, and
Right.
the fact that it didn't get supervised. Actually, here in the UK, we have both ham and bacon with a proud Manchester Hershey. I'm not sure London would give it, but Manchester does. Where, where are you on all of this?
Okay, so those are actually two separate questions. They're very different issues from vegan bacon and lab-grown meat. So let's answer the easier one too, the vegan bacon. There's a long history going back to the 1920s of bacon-like products being certified as kosher. In fact, if you want to look at it, you can even go back to there's some Talmudic texts that talk about the idea that there are things out there that taste like bacon but aren't pig, and so God allows them. As the idea being God prohibited one thing but allowed something else. But we had this in the early 1920s. There was the idea of the beef fry, which is a product that was designed to taste pig-like but not be, and it was very popular. And so what you're getting at too is that impossible meat makes a really great impossible products that are plant-based but taste like meat. They have had impossible sausage and impossible other products that have been both certified as kosher and halal. And when they came out with impossible pork, neither one would give it to them. And the head of the OU even admitted, like, yeah, I mean, technically it should get it, but it feels wrong, right? And that's perfect for my argument, right? Which is I don't have to weigh in on whether it's a right or wrong decision. The fact that he says it feels wrong, right? Like it's an interesting argument for someone to basically say, like, legally, yeah, it's the same ingredients as all the other things that they've certified as kosher. Same factories are making it, right? But it just feels wrong, right? Now, lab-grown meat is something different because you have to decide what is the status of that. So, for example, if you're taking a cell from a living animal, there's the biblical prohibition of the limb from a living animal. So is that taking something off? Now, it's usually understood by like lopping off a leg, right? Is taking off a few skin cells or whatever, or organ cells, and the animal still lives, the same thing? Well, that depends on your perspective, right? So first you have to get over that. Well, then you say, well, what if you slaughter it? Well, does it have to be kosher slaughter or not for that? Or is it so different that it doesn't really matter? It has to be kosher slaughter. Could it be from a pig? No, right? Or no, right? And then it depends. Is it so tiny and things that you don't count it as such? One of the interesting things that came up, there was a recent controversy in Israel because a company wanted to do it, but they wanted to take it from a living animal because they wanted to make it vegan in their understanding, which would mean that, because the easy answer from that perspective was, well, if you do kosher slaughter for it, and it's a kosher animal, and then you take it, then no problem. But they actually wanted to take those cells from a living animal so they could argue for a vegan understanding of it, because then they say because the original animal didn't die, right? Because even you could say vegan, you could say even though you're 30 steps removed from it, one animal died. You say, no, this one, the animals lived a happy life. You know, people were reading them Leviticus in the fields until they died a natural death of old age, right? So it takes it out of that. So that was part of their argument. And then it was interesting, there were legal arguments made that it's not kosher. There was one legal argument made that not only was it kosher, but it was not even considered meat. And so it didn't need shechita, like it didn't need proper rabbinic slaughter.
And you could presumably consume it with dairy at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
I think what's interesting about these things is certainly when I was a child, if you ate such a product, you were required to have the packet on the table so that there should be no doubt that you weren't transgressing. And now that seems to have gone out of the window. Nobody would dream of having to do that. It's become so common and acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's a long history, which is why it's interesting that when it becomes controversial, right? Why? But again, it becomes a story, and if they, with all of these things, if I think that, would it be the same thing if it was imitation? I mean, imitation crab meat, totally fine. Bacon, you go down the long list of that. that are not problematic. You know, how many kosher sushi places have California rolls and no one bats an eye? Um, that goes back to our shellfish being different than pork, right? And so it's an interesting debate there. But yeah, so I'd say that they're similar in that I can bring them back to the same place, but they're different in that there's different underlying issues.
Interesting. So you said you discovered a lot more anecdotes since you wrote
Yes.
this. Do you think you might do another edition or a follow-up, or are you working on something completely
Well,
different?
you know, if everyone could just buy the first run out and then tell my publisher that they would buy 5 more copies if I came out with a new edition, yes. No, I'm collecting it in that I'm still interested in it, right? Maybe if ever if ever that came to it, I would love to. I mean, there's so many cool things I find, but what I tend to do is now that I'm being asked to speak about it, right, I try and bring some of those into this. But it's just a story I'm still intrigued by, and some of it there's new TV shows that come out that make references to it, right? So that didn't exist before, or or new books that come out. You know, I was, and even when this is being an academic, it's kind of hard to be off the clock, right? And so I was like sitting poolside last summer reading. I'm a amateur musician. I was reading an autobiography of Geddy Lee, who's the lead singer and bass player in the band Rush, who's from Canada, and his parents are both Holocaust survivors, and he thought they were very outwardly pious. And then one day he tells the story of discovering his dad secretly eating bacon and eggs, and feeling like that gave him permission to, because he didn't feel connected to Judaism as a religious practice. He very felt strongly culturally identifying and such. And he writes of this scene of discovering it and feeling like it gave him space to interpret Judaism differently for him, right? And here I was just reading a book that I thought had nothing to do with this. Was me. I'm off the clock, right?
Yeah,
And
but you
suddenly I'm
can't
grabbing
get away from it.
I'm like writing notes and and bringing it into a PowerPoint.
Interesting. Well, if you do come up with anything new or anything else, do come back and share it with us. Thank you so
Sure.
much for being our guest this evening. This is Jordan's book. It's available on Amazon and it's available in Kindle format for a little bit less money than the hard copy. And to say thank you, I'll send you some of my photographs of Israelis, which hopefully you'll enjoy reading. Now, just before we go, a few words about our upcoming program. Next week, we have a real treat for you. We've got Anthony Julius, best known as the lawyer who successfully defended Deborah Lipstadt in the libel case against David Irving. And he and I will be discussing his recently published book, Abraham the First Jew. Then on the 7th of July, we welcome John Jay. He picks up the story of Ninette Dreyfus, no relation to the famous Dreyfus, but born in Paris to a very wealthy Jewish family. She was actually a cousin of Albert Einstein. And the cat and mouse true story of how she manages to survive the war years, ending up in the UK. And then on the 14th of July, we've got Jerry Rabov, and he's going to speak about Henry VIII and his rabbis. And yes, you did hear me right, Henry VIII and his rabbis. There's more still. Please visit milim.org.uk and sign up to our newsletter to make sure you're the first to hear about whatever's happening in our program. All of these online events are free, but you can make a donation if you wish to help with our costs. There's a link in the chat, or you can visit our website. It remains for me to thank our guest, Jordan Rosenblum, once again. Thank you so much, Jordan. It's been a real pleasure to chat to you. And looking forward to seeing you all again soon. Until then, stay safe. Take care.